Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the absolute most fascinating histories in all of modern technology, the evolution of Microsoft and its flagship operating system, Windows. We're going to explore how a tiny startup out in the desert fundamentally changed how humanity interacts with computers, right? We'll see how they stumbled when the world went mobile, and then how they pulled off this incredible reinvention for the modern age. So today's Explainer is basically going to function as a chronological roadmap through over 4 decades of really dense, fascinating technological history. We'll start with the command line era, move into the graphical interface wars, look at their period of total world domination, analyze those touchscreen stumbles, and finally explore their new modern era.
All right, let's jump right into Part 1, the command line era, spanning from 1975 to 1984. Long before the slick, polished interfaces we're all used to today, computing was a vastly different, much more intimidating landscape.
Let's move to and see how this builds on our timeline here. It all started in late 1974 when Paul Allen saw the Altair 8800 microcomputer right on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine. He was so excited he rushed to show his high school friend, Bill Gates. By April 1975, the two had officially founded Microsoft in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, they dabbled in some early operating systems, like a Unix variant called Xenix in 1980, but their absolute watershed moment happened in 1981. Microsoft partnered with the hardware giant IBM to bundle their operating system, MS-DOS, on IBM's brand new personal computers. And the absolute genius part of this deal? Microsoft kept the rights to license it to others.
But, what actually was MS-DOS? Well, it was a rudimentary, entirely text-based operating system. You didn't point and click. You had to know the exact, specific text commands to type into a blank prompt just to open a file or run a simple program. For the engineers back in 1981, this was highly functional. But for your average consumer, it was incredibly complex and just completely unintuitive.
And that complexity leads us directly into Part 2, the graphical interface wars, from 1985 to 1994. A massive industry threat emerged that essentially forced Microsoft to rethink their entire operating system's design from the ground up.
And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast they were facing. In 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh. Instead of forcing users to memorize confusing commands, Apple utilized a graphical user interface, or a GUI. Users just interacted with visual icons using a little peripheral device called a mouse. It was a total revelation. It made computing actually accessible to normal people. Microsoft realized immediately that the text-based days of MS-DOS were completely numbered. They needed to pivot, and they needed to do it fast.
So, how did they respond? Well, their first attempt, publicly released as Windows 1.0 in 1985, was actually a complete commercial failure. People thought it was slow and vastly inferior to the Mac. But Microsoft was relentless. In 1987, they released Windows 2.0, which introduced overlapping windows instead of rigid tiles. And finally, in 1990, they struck absolute gold with Windows 3.0. With 16 color graphics, totally new file management, and a development kit for third-party programmers, Windows 3.0 was a massive breakthrough. It sold over 10 million copies in just 2 years.
But there's a really fascinating technical reality underneath all this massive success. The tech writer Ed Bott famously compared Windows to an old house that has been extensively remodeled. The crucial thing to understand here is that early Windows wasn't entirely new code built from scratch. It was essentially just a shiny, graphical layer placed right on top of that old MS-DOS foundation. So through the years, they knocked out walls, added new rooms, fixed the plumbing, but deep down, pieces of that original 1980s foundation remained totally intact to ensure older programs would still run.
And this remodeled house approach brings us nicely to Part 3, Total World Domination, spanning from 1995 to 2001. Entering the mid-90s, Microsoft was perfectly positioned to ride the incoming wave of the home computing revolution.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that these exact innovations established the modern PC experience that you and I still recognize today. Released in August 1995, Windows 95 was a complete paradigm shift. You didn't have to manually launch it from MS-DOS anymore. It loaded automatically on startup. It introduced the now iconic Start button in the bottom taskbar, finally making navigation intuitive for everyone. And crucially, it included a built-in gateway to the emerging World Wide Web, the Internet Explorer browser.
To really understand the sheer cultural impact of Windows 95, you just have to look at this number, 1 million. That is how many copies Microsoft sold in just its first 4 days on the market. It wasn't just a tech release, it was a global pop culture event. By the end of the 90s,
Microsoft had captured over 90% of the world's personal computer market share.
And they cemented that dominance in 2001 with Windows XP. After a few rocky releases in the late 90s, XP heavily reinforced that remodeled house foundation we just talked about. It addressed a lot of the past crashing issues and offered vastly improved speed, stability, and file management. It went on to become one of Microsoft's most beloved and widely used operating systems for well over a decade. But of course, no empire goes unchallenged forever. Let's move to Part 4, Stumbles and Touchscreen Troubles, from 2007 to 2014. Just as Microsoft felt invincible, the entire tech world suddenly shifted right underneath them.
The iPhone and the iPad had arrived, and suddenly traditional desktop PCs were no longer the center of the computing universe, which leads us to this huge question. How do you adapt an old house for touchscreens? How do you take 30 years of legacy software, designed entirely for a mouse and keyboard, and make it work naturally on smooth glass screens?
Well, Microsoft's answer was Windows 8, released in 2012, and man, it sparked an immediate identity crisis. They were basically caught between two completely different user bases. They radically removed the beloved Start menu in traditional desktop, replacing it with this brightly colored, touchscreen-friendly tile layout. While tablet users appreciated it, their core base of hundreds of millions of traditional desktop and laptop users, they were deeply frustrated. It was a bold move for sure, but it alienated the exact people who built the company. So the crucial point is that while Windows 8 struggled on PCs, Microsoft's incredibly costly attempts to conquer the actual smartphone market were even more disastrous. They launched the Kin phone in 2010, and it was utterly rejected, discontinued after just 2 months. Then, in a completely desperate bid to catch up to Apple and Google, they purchased Nokia's phone division in 2014 for an eye-watering $7.2 billion. That strategy backfired so spectacularly that just over a year later, Microsoft had to take a shocking $7.6 billion write-down, letting go of nearly 8,000 employees from those mobile operations. They had essentially lost the mobile war. But the history doesn't end in defeat. This brings us to Part 5, A New Modern Era, from 2014 to the present. Realizing they couldn't just keep doing the same old things, Microsoft underwent one of the most successful corporate pivots in history.
And that modern renaissance was entirely driven by a major change in executive leadership. Look at this breakdown. Bill Gates built the company on operating system dominance. Steve Ballmer heavily grew their enterprise business, but obviously stumbled in that early mobile era. But then, in 2014, Satya Nadella takes over. Nadella recognized that forcing Windows to be the center of every single strategy was holding the company back. He aggressively shifted Microsoft's direction, focusing entirely on cloud computing, embracing open-source software, and making some incredibly strategic acquisitions.
One of his very first victories was fixing the operating system itself. In 2015, they released Windows 10, and it perfectly reconciled those warring aesthetics of the past few years. It brought back the classic Start menu for traditional users, but neatly integrated that modern tile design right inside of it. It also brought in Cortana, their digital assistant. It was a massive hit precisely because it finally balanced the needs of both the desktop loyalists and the new touchscreen users. But to really understand Microsoft today, you've got to look far beyond just Windows. Under Nadella, the company fundamentally altered its historic DNA. They successfully launched their own proprietary Surface computers, proving they could actually build top-tier hardware. Then came this stunning historical reversal. A company whose former executives once literally called open-source software a cancer formally joined the Linux Foundation, fully embracing their old rival. They also shocked the gaming world by dropping $2.5 billion to acquire Mojang, the creators of Minecraft. But the true engine behind securing their future? Azure. They aggressively expanded their cloud computing platform, which now quietly powers the back end of thousands of global businesses.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. Microsoft went from forcing us to memorize text commands, to conquering the desktop with visual icons, to totally stumbling over smartphones, and finally, reinventing themselves as a modern cloud and hardware powerhouse. So, as computing shifts even more heavily away from local operating systems and deeper into the cloud, what will Microsoft's next major structural renovation look like? How will this extensively remodeled software architecture continue to adapt for the next 40 years? It is a fascinating question and one we will definitely be watching unfold. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.